Hey everyone, welcome back to the Nello Reads channel. Our first ProRevenge story of the day comes from Objective Unknown, Poaching Threats and Frogs. Lots and lots of frogs. This is a story about Pops, my grandfather, and how he got some sweet revenge on some squatters. This goes way back, 1998 to be exact. I was 10 years old. My farm back then was Pops' family farm, way up north in Ontario. My farm is not a small farm. It's the biggest plot of land in the area, but not only that, it has the most workable farmland. There's about 80 acres of good workable farmland, including pastures, and another 120 acres of dense forest and marshland. Back in the 90s, Northern Ontario had a breakout of a type of moth. They would spin silk high in the trees, and really, they caused no harm other than being a nuisance. But the government had the great idea to crop dust the forests of Ontario, causing an ecological disaster. With the loss of the moths and the chemicals in the water, a type of frog was nearly wiped out. We called them leopard frogs. They are very green with these big black spots on them. After that, they were put on the endangered species list. The back end of my property runs off into a small marshland and into the lake. Back in the 90s, Pops was having a problem with poachers. They were camping in the back area, hunting out of season, killing and eating turtles out of the marsh, and just effing up the property. Back in the day, that forest was my playground. I know that area like the back of my hand. But unfortunately, I had a run-in with the poachers. They threatened to shoot me, so I told Pops. We went out there with our local lawman, but they had packed up and were gone before we could get there. Unfortunately, they returned the week after, as we could hear the rifle shots. Pops tried to find them with the lawman several times, but with no luck. Now, here's where all the information from the start comes into play. Pops, as hard as he tried, wanted them gone, but it wasn't working. Pops was also a fisherman, and his favorite bait was none other than the leopard frog. But because they were added to the endangered species list, the use was outright banned. Pops, being a reasonable fisherman and generally caring about the land, figured, oh hell, now's the time to kill two birds with one stone. He approached the Canadian fishery and game wardens, and through a lot of work, got in touch with an ecological survey team who decided that our little marsh was the perfect place for a spawning pool to raise little leopard frogs. And that's what happened in the back area where our marsh was fenced in, and they started breeding tadpoles. Not only that, the poachers' hunting ground happened to fall in the protected zone. Once the work started, it took a full year for the poachers to return. But Pops had a weapon now. His phone. Once he could hear that familiar sound of rifles going off where no rifle should fire, he made a single phone call to the game warden. They had over a dozen wardens up there in less than an hour, and the poachers were caught. Not only were they caught with the carcass of a bear and other animals, they were found with buckets and buckets of our little leopard frogs. Not only did they hunt without a license, they also poached an endangered species to be used as illegal bait. From what I learned through the locals, they did 2 years in a big-time prison. All because Pops cared about the little froggies. Over 5 million of the frogs were raised on that marsh over 10 years. They were released through marshes and forests in Ontario. You would have a hard time finding a leopard frog across Ontario that was not somehow related to a frog that came out of my little marsh. So it turns out OP actually has quite a few other stories about his Pops, so if you liked this one, let me know and I'll try and reach out to get his permission to read more. Speaking of likes, you could also press the like button, but based on this one post alone, Pops seems pretty awesome, so I'd love to read more of these. Our next story comes from Echo1771. I went from school teacher to chairman of the board of a big company for the sake of revenge. When I was a tiny kid, my father was my best friend. He worked multiple jobs to support my family, all while powering his way through law school. He even built a couple of small businesses from the ground up with a couple of his friends. All while doing this, he managed to be the best dad ever, spending as much time as he could with my mother, myself, and my baby siblings. One day, we found out that he had stage 4 stomach cancer, the kind that you don't recover from. My mother and I stayed by his side all the way until it was over. The last memory I have of my father was when he was completely immobile, practically a vegetable at this point, with tubes going in and out of his body, and me just praying that he'd still be able to remember who I was. All the guy could do was smile at me, just to let me know he still recognized his son, even if the doctors told us most of his memories would be gone. Eventually, he fell into a coma for a few days before waking up to say goodbye to my mother, who was by his side when he died. She was a housewife, so we didn't really have much to go on after his death. Enter my grandfather. He was one of those self-centered boomer types who makes everything about himself. After my father died, he'd use the newspaper obituary to boast about his dead son's grades and achievements, which I realized seemed to be the only thing my dad was to him. Just in case you were wondering, yes, we are Asian. My mother was grieving and trying to find a way to make ends meet, and my grandfather graciously offered to help her control my father's two businesses to help support us. My mother agreed because she didn't have any experience. While we grew up, the two businesses didn't provide much for us, likely because my father was one of the big reasons they were thriving. Mom was in and out of multiple jobs just to keep us afloat. My grandfather offered to help put me and my siblings through school. I managed to score some scholarships with some good schools growing up, so thankfully he didn't have to do as much for me, but we were really glad that he helped out with my siblings. After I made it out of school, I found out that my family was broke, and my two siblings were still making their way through medical school. My sister even offered to stop and just get a job, but I told her to keep going because she was doing so well and that she deserved to graduate. My grandparents had cut us off because they didn't approve of the directions my siblings took in life, especially my sister, who was, for them, too female to have a career in medicine. My grandmother is a bit of a misogynist.
Why are you wasting your time and money becoming a doctor? You're just going to have children and quit.
I was working as a high school teacher when I was contacted by one of my dad's old business partners from one of his companies. After I asked him about how the company was doing, he told me that my grandfather, who was still in control of my father's shares, was siphoning money from the company for himself, and he was earning way more than he was giving me and my siblings for our education. So, all our lives, he'd been making us feel indebted to him for money that was supposed to be ours to begin with, and he lied to us by telling us that Dad's companies weren't making any money for us at all. We also realized that when he cut us off, he was cutting us off from our own money, forcing my siblings to drop out and give up careers that they'd been working for their whole lives. What's worse is that this was our father's money, and we knew that he'd wanted it to help us provide for our futures even after he died. And here comes his a-hole father basically crapping on his legacy for his own enrichment. I even found out that he used his position to take possession of the company's office space and force them to set up shop in a smaller, cheaper office, while renting the original space out under his own name to the company's competitors to make money from them too. All while I had to work multiple jobs to help my mother and siblings pay the bills. Cue revenge. My grandfather's biggest weakness has always been his pride. In fact, I suspect that he wanted us to think he was helping support us out of his own pocket, because he wanted everyone to think he was some kind of hero, when in reality he was financially choking us. I recognized that no matter what my grandfather said, my siblings, my mother, and I were legally the owners of my father's company shares. So, after having a statement signed by the three of them, I approached the board of directors without my grandfather and let them know that I was now the sole representative of my late dad's estate. My grandfather also made himself chairman of the board. According to the company records, he did no work for the company at all, so the position was just a name that allowed him to receive money. So, I convinced them that since he was only chairman, as representative of my father's estate, that made me the chairman. I did not intend to keep the position because I did not have the experience for it. Then I contacted other members of my extended family about my grandfather's unethical practices with the company's office space. He was eventually pressured by them into evicting the company's main competitor from their office space. Serves them right for conniving with my grandfather to take the company's old office space. At the next board meeting, I prepared for the moment I'd been waiting for my entire life. When he entered the conference room to preside over the meeting as the chairman, he found his chair facing away from the table, with all the board members already seated at the table, and, like a Bond villain, I spun the chair around to reveal to him that I'd been the one sitting there the entire meeting. I told him that the company and my family no longer needed him, and that I'd be taking control over representation of my father's estate. "Do you know I'm the one who put him and his siblings through school?" he said in shock. I only went, "No, Dad did." The look of sheer embarrassment on his face was perfect. I've never seen him look defeated my entire life until that moment, and this sort of satisfaction could not be achieved by simply ratting him out. I stepped down from the chairman position and took a job in the company's treasury department as a bookkeeper with a meager salary, but at least now any profit sharing or dividends that the company released would go where my father wanted it to go. And finally, one of the first decisions I got to make as a board member before stepping down was to give my mother a permanent job that she deserved. My grandfather is now jobless. He spends all his time at home, and because he spent his life being selfish and self-centered, he has no friends. All he had going for him was being able to power trip over other people and boasting about his assets and achievements. Even my grandmother has had it with him, and the two don't even sleep in the same room anymore. I hope he lives the rest of his short life regretting that he didn't live his life with more compassion and humility. Edit. I've gotten a lot of comments about the legality of what went on. During all this, the only lawyer working in the company was my grandfather, and we all knew he did nothing. When we hired a team of actual helpful lawyers, they told us exactly the same thing you guys pointed out. They're still trying to clean everything up so we don't get into big trouble. Update. Apparently my sister saw this post and just informed me that he's kind of miserable now because his wife is angry at him because he siphoned what's left of their money to an extramarital sugar baby he had in probably another attempt at getting someone to affirm and glorify him. I guess he hasn't learned. I can't even imagine screwing over someone like that, let alone someone in my own family. The grandfather's behavior is just unacceptable, and I guess to quote the Joker, you get what you deserve. The next story comes from Infinite Respect 4757. Revenge is a dish served very, very, very cold. In my young 20s, I moved to a new city to try and start my career and life. Money was very tight, but I was confident I would get things up and running. In my job search, I came across a promising opportunity at a small firm, The Firm. Instead of offering me the job, the owner said he would like me to come in for 2 days and work. If it was a fit, they would hire me, and if not, they would pay me for the 2 days. Money was so tight at the time that I figured taking the bus to and from the job was a luxury I could not afford. So I walked an hour each way to get there. Money was very tight. I did good work both days and worked very hard, but it was not a fit. The owner then tells me, "I know we said we would pay you, but it's just too complicated to set you up for just 2 days, so you will just have to be happy you got experience with us." The way he acted really rubbed me the wrong way. I was mad as I needed the money, but I was trying to find a job, and I figured it was not in my best interest to make waves as word may get around that I was difficult. I did, however, decide that someday, some way, I would get my revenge on the owner. I did find a good job that led to a great career, but I always kept tabs on the owner, looking for the time and place to get some revenge, and even a few times considered some more juvenile methods. Just short of 20 years passed, and now I was a senior in my chosen profession. Instead of working for a small firm, I was a leader in a very large national company that hired firms. As it turns out, we had a large contract come up that I was the lead executive on for the procurement team in the area that the firm operated in. Things have changed a bit over the years, but bidding on these contracts was at the firm's expense back then. However, to safeguard them from wasting too much money, the bidding would be in stages. Well, sure enough, the owner and his firm put in an exploratory bid. They were not perfect for the job, but they could actually do it, so I assisted in moving them to the next stage, and the next stage, and then the final stage. The easiest thing I could have done was to shut them down right away and got a bit of revenge, but they were qualified, so I didn't do that. There was some risk to letting them go through to the end though. Though I was the lead, it was a team decision, and to be honest, if they had the best proposal, despite my thirst for revenge, I would vote for them. The proposals and presentation came in, and luckily, the other firm was a bit better, and we went with them. Normally, the executive lead didn't deliver the bad news in the bid process, but I volunteered to take on the call, and that was my little dose of revenge. It was fun to call the owner, who had no idea we met 20 years ago, and tell him, "We were impressed with your proposal, but it is just not the right fit. I know you must be disappointed to not get the contract, but at least you got great exposure to our process." I know I should have used his own words from 20 years ago, but I could not bring myself to do it. The firm must have done about 200 hours of work on their proposal, so I figured that was payback for my 16 hours with 20 years of interest. Again, just like the last story, how does someone just screw someone over and lie straight to their face? Like, if you tell someone you're going to pay them, you pay them. OP literally got scammed out of probably hundreds of dollars from a well-established business. Like, what kind of weird world do we live in where that makes sense? Anyway, I hope you enjoyed today's stories, and I'll see you in the next video.